By the time I realized he was living off me, nothing dramatic had happened. No fights. No ultimatums. No moment where I could say I should have known better. I had finished a late meeting and stopped at a small wine bar 2 blocks from my apartment, wanting something dry and uncomplicated. That was the night he first appeared. Already there, already settled, already moving as if my space was familiar to him. When he spoke to me, it was because I reached for the same bottle on the shelf behind the bar. He said something light about it being overrated anyway. I smiled, took another, and that could have been the end of it. Instead, a few minutes later, he was next to me. He said he worked nearby, that he usually didn't come in on Tuesdays either. He asked what I did, and when I answered, he didn't interrupt or try to impress me with adjacent knowledge. He just listened. That alone felt unusual enough to register. I noticed the way he asked questions that stayed open. Not digging, not probing. He didn't ask if I was married. He didn't ask how old I was. He asked whether I liked what I did or if I was just good at it. I remember thinking that it was a reasonable question, one that didn't demand a performance. He told me he was in between things. Consulting, temporary contracts, nothing permanent yet. He said it without apology. I had met enough men my age who said similar things with far more defensiveness. With him, it sounded provisional, not strategic. At least that's how it landed. We talked for almost an hour. He didn't touch me. He didn't lower his voice. When I stood up to leave, he said he'd enjoyed the conversation and asked if he could see me again. Not dinner. Coffee. I noticed that detail. Felt like restraint. On the walk home, I replayed the evening the way I usually do after a meeting, checking for inconsistencies. I didn't find any that mattered. He hadn't asked for my number too early. He hadn't overstayed. He hadn't tried to escalate. The next morning, there was a text. He said he hoped I'd made it home easily and suggested a cafe near my office. He added that if my schedule was packed, another time would be fine. I noticed that too. Coffee, he showed up on time. He paid without comment. He told me about a project that had fallen through and how he was recalibrating. He said it was uncomfortable to depend on timing instead of effort. That phrase stayed with me. It sounded like something a thoughtful person would say, not a rehearsed line. He asked about my work again, more specifically this time. When I mentioned a recent acquisition, he didn't react with awe or envy. He said it must have taken stamina. That felt accurate. I remember thinking that accuracy mattered more than admiration. Over the next weeks, we saw each other irregularly. Short dinners. Long walks. He fit himself around my life instead of trying to pull me into his. Seemed considerate. It also meant I didn't have to change anything yet. I told myself that was the point. By the time I realized he had become a fixture, it didn't feel like an intrusion. He never asked for weekends right away. Fridays were usually off the table because he said he picked up last-minute work when it appeared. Sundays he reserved for himself. That left the middle of the week, which worked for me. My calendar already belonged to other people on Mondays and Thursdays, and I liked having something contained in between. I noticed how carefully he accepted my boundaries. If I said I had an early morning, he didn't suggest staying over. If I canceled, he didn't punish me with silence. He said he understood and then demonstrated that he did. That consistency made it easy not to question his availability. He spoke often about momentum, about how some careers moved in visible lines and others in fragments. He said he'd always trusted his ability to land on his feet, but that lately the ground felt softer than expected. I didn't hear complaint in it. I heard adjustment. That mattered. At some point, he started staying at my place. Not officially, just occasionally. A toothbrush appeared in my bathroom, then disappeared again. He didn't leave clothes behind. He didn't make space for himself in drawers. He behaved like a guest who knew how long he was allowed to remain. One night, while we were cooking, he mentioned that his lease was coming up. He said the building was being sold, and that the new owners were raising rents aggressively. He shrugged when he said it. No pause. No expectation. I registered the information and moved on. Later, lying in bed, he said it was strange to feel unrooted in your 30s. He said most people he knew were either locked into mortgages or divorces. He said he felt suspended between phases. I remember thinking that suspension was temporary by nature. It didn't sound dangerous. I offered practical responses. Names of neighborhoods. A broker I'd used years ago. He thanked me but said he wasn't ready to commit to anything long-term. He said flexibility was still his advantage. That sounded reasonable. It matched what he'd told me from the beginning. A few weeks after that, he showed up quieter than usual. He said a contract had been delayed indefinitely. He said he was fine, but that he'd underestimated how much buffer he had left. He said it calmly, as if stating weather conditions. I didn't rush to fix it. I listened. I noticed that he didn't ask for anything. When he left that night, he kissed me longer than usual and said he appreciated how steady I was. I didn't ask what he meant by that. The first time money entered the room explicitly, it was indirect. He said he was thinking of putting his things in storage for a month or two, just until things stabilized. He said he could stay with friends, but that it was complicated. Everyone had families now. He said he hated feeling like an inconvenience. I remember standing at the kitchen counter holding my phone, calculating. Storage units. Short-term rentals. Hotels. None of it made sense as a stopgap. What made sense was the spare bedroom I already had, furnished and unused. I didn't offer it immediately. The next time we saw each other, he mentioned he'd found a temporary solution. A friend who was traveling. Sublet very short term. He said it like a relief. I noticed that he hadn't asked me. That made the decision feel like mine. I told him he could stay with me if he wanted. I framed it as efficiency. No rush. No timeline. Just a place to land while he figured things out. He looked at me for a moment before answering. Then he said he didn't want to impose. I said it wouldn't be an imposition if it was temporary. He said temporary was all he could promise right now. That felt honest enough. Living together didn't begin with a decision. It began with logistics. He arrived with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. He placed them neatly against the wall in the spare room and asked where I preferred he keep his shoes. He said he'd be out of my way during the day. He asked what time I usually woke up. I noticed how quickly he adjusted his movements to the rhythm of the apartment. The first week felt efficient. He made coffee in the mornings without noise. He took calls on the balcony. He cleaned the kitchen after himself. If anything, the space felt calmer, as if his presence absorbed some unused air. He contributed in ways that weren't financial. He handled small repairs I'd postponed. A loose cabinet hinge. A light fixture that flickered. He said he liked having something tangible to fix while everything else was uncertain. That sounded plausible. We didn't renegotiate intimacy. Stayed the same. Familiar, contained. He didn't act territorial. He didn't leave marks. When I worked late, he reheated leftovers and ate alone. When I traveled, he asked if I wanted him there when I got back or if I needed the place to myself. I noticed how rarely he mentioned money directly. When he did, it was abstract. Cash flow. Timing. Lag. He said he hated feeling dependent, that it made him cautious. I believed him because his caution showed. After about a month, he suggested contributing to utilities. I told him it wasn't necessary right now. He nodded and didn't insist. I told myself it was temporary, that this was a narrow bridge, not a destination. One evening, he said he'd been offered a promising lead. A longer contract, maybe permanent. He said it was contingent on a certification he'd need to complete quickly. The exam fee was significant. He said he was weighing options. I asked how significant. He gave me a number that didn't alarm me. It was less than I spent on a weekend away. I didn't offer immediately. I asked when the exam was. He said in 3 weeks. Later that night, I transferred the money. I told him the next morning, framing it as an investment in efficiency. No interest. No pressure. He protested briefly, then thanked me with visible relief. He said he'd pay me back as soon as the contract came through. I said it wasn't urgent. That was the first transaction with a future attached to it. After that, things blurred slightly. Not dramatically, just enough. He began talking through decisions with me. Not asking permission, just including me. He asked what I thought about cities, about whether remote work would change how people dated. He said it was nice to talk to someone who understood long horizons. I noticed that his things stopped feeling temporary. A jacket on the chair, books on the coffee table, groceries he preferred appearing in the fridge. None of it arrived all at once. It accumulated the way habits do. The exam passed. The contract moved forward, then stalled. He said the company was restructuring. He said these things took time. He said he was frustrated but optimistic. I didn't doubt the delays. I'd seen enough of them in my own world. Timelines slipped. Promises softened. That didn't make them false. What I did notice was how comfortable he seemed in the waiting. He slept better. He ate regularly. He stopped talking about storage units and sublets. When he spoke about the future, it began to include plural pronouns lightly without emphasis. I told myself that was natural. Proximity creates language. Still, there were moments when I caught myself adjusting. I ordered groceries with his preferences in mind. I shifted meetings to be home earlier. I didn't articulate these changes. I absorbed them. One night, as we were turning off the lights, he said he felt safe with me. He said it quietly, as if stating a fact rather than offering a compliment. I said I was glad. The shift wasn't sudden. That's what made it easy to miss. It began with small assumptions. He stopped asking if I'd be home for dinner and started planning as if I would be. If I said I had an evening event, he adjusted his plans around it instead of making his own. He framed it as convenience. I accepted it as coordination. He spoke less about work, not because there was none, but because the updates had become repetitive. Still waiting. Still promising. Still complicated. I didn't press. I knew how fragile momentum could be when it was named too often. What I did notice was how confidently he inhabited my routines. He began using my car during the day. He asked the first time, explaining that it made interviews easier than relying on rideshares. I said yes without hesitation. After that, he told me when he needed it instead of asking. The difference was subtle enough to feel earned. He suggested changes to the apartment. Nothing structural. Lighting. A rug that would warm the room. A different coffee machine that he said would pay for itself. He framed these as shared improvements. I let him order them on my account. It felt efficient. One evening, he came home unusually energized. He said he'd met someone who could fast-track things. A former colleague with influence. He said it might require a short unpaid period, but that it would position him well. He said these were the moments where patience mattered. He asked what I thought. I said it sounded strategic. Because it did. A week later, he mentioned that his phone bill had lapsed. He said it casually, laughing at himself. He said he'd forgotten to update his card after the last delay. I paid it while he showered. I didn't announce it. He noticed anyway and thanked me. Then said he hated that I was carrying things that weren't mine. I told him it was temporary. That word still worked then. There were dinners with my friends. He fit in easily. He was attentive without performing. He listened more than he spoke. When they complimented my place, he said I had good instincts. When they asked what he did, he described his work without embellishment. I watched their faces soften. That mattered to me more than I admitted. At night, he sometimes spoke about the kind of partnership he wanted. He said he admired women who knew how to build and sustain. He said most men were intimidated by that. He said he felt lucky to be close to it. I noticed how carefully those statements landed. Admiration without obligation. Intimacy without commitment. I didn't challenge them because there was nothing overt to challenge. The certification money wasn't repaid. Not because he refused, but because there was always a reason to wait. The contract was nearly finalized. The paperwork was moving. Didn't feel like avoidance. Felt like timing. I told myself that trust included tolerance. The first time I felt irritation, it surprised me. He had invited a friend to stay over without asking. Just one night, he said. The friend left early, apologetic. I said nothing, but I noticed how my silence was interpreted as consent. After that, there were more assumptions. Groceries he didn't like went uneaten. My preferred schedule shifted toward his. When I suggested a weekend alone, he said he understood, but asked if everything was okay between us. The question reframed the request. I adjusted. I still didn't feel taken advantage of. That word felt too sharp, too deliberate. What I felt was gradual responsibility. One night, as we were locking up, he said he didn't know what he'd do without me right now. He said it lightly, almost playfully, but the weight of it stayed after he fell asleep. I lay awake longer than usual, listening to the apartment settle, noticing how full it felt. The break didn't arrive as an argument. It arrived as clarity. It happened on a Thursday morning. I was reviewing statements before a flight, scanning out of habit more than concern. One charge didn't belong. Then another. Small amounts spaced carefully. Subscriptions I didn't use. A short-term rental deposit in a city I hadn't visited. I didn't confront him immediately. I finished packing. I made coffee. I watched him move through the kitchen with the ease of someone who believed he was entitled to the space. When I asked him about the charges, I kept my voice neutral. I said I was probably missing something. He didn't deny them. He didn't panic either. He said he'd meant to tell me. He said an opportunity had come up faster than expected. A short project, remote but with occasional travel. He said he hadn't wanted to distract me before my trip. He said he'd planned to explain everything once it stabilized. I asked why my card was used. He said his accounts were still tangled. He said he'd assumed it was fine because we were sharing expenses anyway. He said he knew he should have asked. He said he was sorry. The apology was correct. Timed well. Delivered calmly. I asked where the rental was. He hesitated just long enough to be noticeable. Then he said it was a backup. A place to stay closer to the client if things accelerated. He said it didn't mean anything about us. That was when I understood the structure. He hadn't been planning an exit. He'd been building optionality. My apartment was the base. My money was the lubricant. His future was modular. I told him I was leaving for the airport. I said we'd talk when I got back. He nodded and said he loved me. He didn't reach for me when he said it. He said it like a conclusion rather than a request. On the plane, I didn't cry. I made notes. Dates. Amounts. Patterns. I wasn't angry. I was focused. That felt worse. While I was gone, he texted updates. About the project. About how much he missed me. About how stressful things were becoming. He said he hated feeling like things were slipping just as they were getting good. I didn't respond beyond logistics. When I returned, the apartment felt altered. Not violated. Just rearranged. His jacket was gone from the chair. The books remained. He said he'd given me space. That night, I asked him to sit down. I told him I'd looked more closely. I told him I wasn't comfortable with how decisions had been made. I said I needed transparency if we were going to continue. He listened. He nodded. He said he understood. Then he said something careful. He said he worried that my success made it hard for me to trust vulnerability. He said I was used to control. He said he felt like he was always auditioning for stability in my world. He said maybe that imbalance had pushed him to secure things quietly. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't defensive. He reframed. I saw then how often I'd accepted reframing as explanation. I told him I needed him to move out. He didn't argue. He said he'd already anticipated it. He said he didn't want to cause damage. He said he hoped this didn't erase what we'd had. The next morning, he left with more than he'd arrived with. Not visibly, but materially in ways that didn't show on the floor. After he closed the door, I stood in the kitchen and noticed how quiet it was. Not empty, clear. The days after he left didn't feel dramatic. They felt procedural. I changed passwords. I closed shared access. I canceled subscriptions I hadn't chosen. Each action was small and precise. There was no sense of urgency, only completion. I noticed how familiar that mode felt, how easily I stepped back into it. The apartment returned to its earlier proportions. Space reappeared where presence had been. I moved the chair back to where it used to be. I put the coffee machine he liked into the hall closet. I didn't throw it away. I just removed it from my mornings. He sent one message 2 days later. He said he hoped I was well. He said he'd transferred some money and would continue to do so until things were even. He said he was grateful for what I'd offered him at a difficult time. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted silence to punish him. Because there was nothing left to clarify. Any response would have reopened structure, and I was finished maintaining it. I noticed physical things first. I slept through the night. My jaw unclenched without instruction. I stopped checking my phone between meetings. When I walked into my apartment, my shoulders dropped automatically, as if my body recognized ownership again. Friends asked questions carefully. I gave them accurate answers without detail. I said it had run its course. I said it wasn't dramatic. Both were true. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was the precision of how it had worked. I could see now how each step had been reasonable. How no single moment demanded refusal. How care had been used as proof of safety. How love, or something adjacent to it, had functioned as permission rather than promise. I didn't revise the past to make myself foolish. I hadn't been. Every decision had made sense at the time it was made. That was the most unsettling part. One evening, about a week later, I came home later than planned. I took off my shoes by the door and didn't move them out of habit. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the quiet. I made myself something simple to eat. I didn't sit at the table. I leaned against the counter and ate standing up. Halfway through, I realized I wasn't thinking about him at all. That registered as a physical sensation. Light. Neutral. Before bed, I washed my face and caught my reflection. Nothing about me looked changed. That felt right. The change wasn't visible. It was operational. I turned off the lights and went to bed alone. The sheets were cool. The room held its shape. As I lay there, one feeling settled in, not relief, not sadness. Alignment.